Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship presently and across time. This episode will explore entactogens, which are drugs like MDMA, 2CB, and Methalone. We start with setting a basic framework for what entactogens are and some example drugs before getting into the complexities in their various effects, mechanisms of action, and both the legislative and technical process of the development of novel or new entactogenic drugs. Being that entactogenic drugs are some variation of MDMA, most of the time, we do quite a lot of discussion on MDMA as a molecule, as a medicine, and as, well, a drug out there in the world. This includes an in-depth discussion on the pharmacology of MDMA, the neurological basis of the so-called losing the magic phenomenon, and an emerging theory on how to bring the magic back through a nutritional supplement called N-acetylcysteine. There is also some discussion on the anti-fun moralism in what society deems and allows as medicine, the importance of developing take-home entactogens that can be prescribed off-label, and the negative social consequences of prohibitionist law enforcement and drug laws. Finally, in the final act of this interview, we discuss the psychedelic biotech industry as a whole, some problematic moves being taken by various companies in this space, such as what's called patent trolling, and how Tactogen is trying to do better for both psychedelics and psychedelic users. Our guest for this episode is Matthew Baggott, co-founder and CEO of Tactogen. Matthew Baggott is a neuroscientist who has worked over 3 decades to legally study MDMA and related molecules. His research has ranged from studying the neurotoxicity of amphetamines in rodents to studying changes in emotional experience in people who have been given MDA or MDMA in a laboratory setting. Matthew, as I just mentioned, is co-founder and CEO of Tactogen Incorporated, a public benefit corporation that is developing a next generation of gentler, more accessible MDMA-like medicines. Before starting Tactogen, Matthew was a director of data science and engineering at Genentech, and Matthew studied philosophy as an undergraduate at University of Chicago and earned his PhD in neuroscience at University of California, Berkeley. So that's a little taste of what you're about to jump into in today's interview. I just want to say I don't presently have any financial involvement or stake in Tactogen. That might change in the future if they open up their funding campaign again, but I have no financial interest here, and so I don't believe I have any conflict of interest. Just letting you know I don't presently have any financial involvement with this company, although that might not be the case forever. One final piece before we get into the interview is that this podcast is brought to you by listeners like you on Patreon. So thank you so much to my patrons who help not only make this podcast possible, but help make it possible for me to put my daily working hours and days and weeks and months and years to developing a body of work that is showcased through this podcast and various other media, and eventually through the writing of more books, one of which the writing process is again underway. So big thank you to my patrons. I couldn't be doing this without you. Thank you so much. The people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube give significantly, some of which for a long time. So an extra thank you to them. Their names are also listed in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. If you're finding value in this show, I would love for you to reciprocate that value in some show of financial appreciation, such as becoming a patron on Patreon or leaving a one-time donation. You can do so via the links that are in the description to this episode, wherever you are checking it out. And if you're not in a place where financial contribution is available to you, stress not. Please enjoy the show, enjoy the content. It's out there for you. Those with funds are offering the funds as they have it so that the show goes, as was the saying, the show can go on. So yes, appreciate, enjoy, fund if you can. And that's all for the preamble and the intro. Here is my interview with Matthew Baggott on episode 177 of Adventures Through the Mind. Enjoy. Matthew Baggott, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thanks for having me.
So this conversation is going to be couched in the fact that you are the CEO, is that correct, of Tactogen, or one of the founders of Tactogen, which I will ask you about later on. But I want to explore in as much thorough detail as we can entactogens. This is an area that I haven't really explored too much on the podcast. Handful of episodes about MDMA specifically, but MDMA is, in some sense, just the most accessible step to entactogens with respect to access to the sort of a wide variety of potential molecules. But to start us off, why don't you give us essentially what a definition of an entactogen is?
Sure. So entactogen is a term that David Nichols came up with for the class of molecules that includes MDMA. And it means generating touching within. And he named it that because MDMA and related molecules don't really seem like classical psychedelics where there's a sense of maybe transcendence. Instead, what MDMA seems to do really well is allow you to almost like be more naturally yourself. And people often describe feeling less self-critical and less neurotic. And it's almost as if they're kind of taking off their psychic armor and just relaxing into who they are. And it seems like this type of experience can be very helpful for accelerating psychotherapy and doing personal work and having realizations and things, in part because it makes you less avoidant. And so people are able to think about things that they normally find upsetting and that normally they kind of keep on the edges of their consciousness. But when they're in this state induced by this class of medicine, they're able to just, honestly look at the truth of the matter. And for many people, that can allow them to process things and, move forward and get unstuck. Pharmacologically, MDMA and other entactogens work very differently from psychedelics, whereas psychedelics are molecules that are agonists, that is, they stimulate the 5-HT2A receptor, a subtype of serotonin receptor. MDMA and related molecules seem to more work by causing increased extracellular levels of serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine. And not to say that there isn't a little tiny bit of overlap in terms of how the molecules might feel. Some people might say that, 2CB, which is a psychedelic, in lower doses feels a bit like MDMA. And probably the reason for that is that when MDMA is releasing serotonin, it's going on to stimulate various serotonin receptors. And some of those receptors are ones that 2CB is hitting directly. And so that's probably why there's a bit of an overlap there.
Right, because 2CB is a phenethylamine-based classical psychedelic, and so it does modulate. It is an agonist to the 5-HT2A receptor.
Exactly.
Does it have any pharmacological overlap with MDMA? Like, does it impact extracellular levels of serotonin at all that you know of, that we know
of? It doesn't seem to. So we think it's more that it's both a 5-HT2A agonist, and my guess is that it's probably also an agonist at some of the 5-HT1 receptors, like 5-HT1B. And there's some work that's been done, mostly at Stanford University, looking at what receptors are involved in mice feeling more social on MDMA. And it seems like the 5-HT1B receptor is important for that. And so if I had to guess, I would say that probably the psychedelics that in lower doses have a kind of rolly MDMA-like feel, maybe ones that are additionally stimulating the 5-HT1B receptor.
So this goes into, so kind of open the window on entactogens being a wide variety of substances that aren't necessarily chemically related to MDMA, although some of them are. Can you give us an example of some of the entactogens that are known about and researched at this time? For example, I know that MDBE, MDE, 5-MeO, DIPT, like these kinds of things. Can you give us a little sort of a quick foray into the landscape of known and presently researched entactogens?
Sure, yeah. So I would probably say that like 5-MeO, MIPT, or DIPT are probably not really entactogens the way I would categorize it. And I would also say the same of 5-HT, of 2CB. So rather than categorizing them in terms of the experiential elements, I would say entactogens would be molecules that rely on this increasing extracellular monoamine neurotransmitters, and that's fundamental to their definition.
Although, sorry to interrupt,
Sure.
wasn't I just was reading about 5-MeO dipped the Foxy molecule today, and it did suggest that there was some binding to the serotonin cert gate. So would it sort of start crossing that line there as well?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So 5-methoxy-DIPT does seem to interact with the serotonin transporter a little bit, whereas MIPT doesn't. And so, yeah, maybe there is a quality of the entactogen effect with that molecule. And so most of the molecules that we would consider entactogens or empathogens generating empathy, which was an earlier term for the molecule class, are either tryptamines or phenethylamines or phenalkylamines, you might even say, because the carbon chain could be different lengths. And so the MDMA is the best known one, but you can modify the MDMA molecule in a bunch of ways. There's a single carbon that's attached to the nitrogen, the amine, and you can lengthen that carbon to 2 carbons, and then you have MDE. You can take the carbon that's hanging down right next to the nitrogen, and you can extend that to 2 carbons, and then you have MBDB. And you can add on a oxygen 1 carbon over from the one we just talked about and make a cathinone style molecule, and then you have methalone or bk-MDMA. And so those are all things you can do on the side chain of the molecule and make different types of entactogens. And then with the main sort of ring system of the molecule, you can remove one of the oxygens and put a carbon in there and also add in a double bond, and then you get the benzofurans. So like 5-MAPB or 6-MAPB. And on the side chain as well, we could also remove the carbon from the nitrogen, and then you'd have MDA, or in the case of the benzofurans, you'd have 5-APB and 6-APB. So those are some of the best known ones that are in the phenolkylamine class. And then with tryptamines, the sort of best known entactogens would be alpha-ethyltryptamine and alpha-methyltryptamine. And alpha-methyltryptamine is one of these ones that, like MDA, has a fair amount of psychedelic component to it, as well as the entactogen component. So those are some of the big ones. In terms of ones that have been used, therapeutically, a lot of the work has been with MDMA, but in the underground, certainly there's been a fair amount of work with, methalone and MDE and the benzofurans.
Which of these molecules are, I guess, I'll ask specifically about maybe your company and what your goals are a little bit later on, but are any of these molecules specifically in development or research? Because my assumption is that maybe we could talk more about this later, but there's a bunch of companies that are likely just looking into what's popular on the subculture and what still is patent free enough that they can extract out of the sort of the substrate of psychonautic exploration, and then sort of privatize, capitalize, or proprietarize, capitalize, etc. But are there any in particular that are sort of like rising to the top in the sort of field of like, these are the ones that people are looking to develop to enter into the industry?
That's a great question. And right now, most of the plans of companies that are interested in entactogens are, not publicly stated. So we don't entirely know what these companies are planning to develop. to the extent that we do know, for the subset of the companies that have said something publicly, a lot of it seems to be focusing on the R enantiomer of MDMA. And so there's, at least 3 companies that have said they're interested in developing the R enantiomer of MDMA. So, an enantiomer is, essentially like a handedness for a molecule. If you draw a molecule out in 2 dimensions, the way we normally see them, we normally emit the hydrogens from that are sticking off almost every place. And if you drew in the hydrogens, it would become more apparent that there's some like points in some of these molecules where you can have like a handedness phenomenon where, sort of flat, like your hands might look sort of the same, but in 3 dimensions, like one leg sticks out and one, in one direction and one goes the other way.
So simply put, almost like a left side and a right side mirror image of each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you synthesize molecules like MDMA, and really all the ones we've talked about, you will get this, depending on essentially like how the molecules randomly come together, you will get some of them are left-handed and some of them are right-handed. And because we're talking about such a large number of molecules being synthesized because they're tiny, so like, even a milligram has a huge number of molecules, you end up just statistically with having it be 50% left-handed and 50% right-handed. And, it turns out that this makes a big difference in terms of interacting with, receptors and proteins and enzymes and things like that. So a lot of the activity from MDMA is probably from the S enantiomer. Mm. And the R enantiomer is less active. But if you take a higher dose or put a higher concentration into, some assay system, you will find that the R enantiomer does have effects, but it has much less ability to release dopamine. Mm. And so these companies are interested in the R enantiomer of MDMA in part because it seems less dopaminergic, which makes it seem like kind of less potentially toxic.
Mm. And to clarify, assay is where you test its activity, right? Like a bioassay is giving it to some biological system. A self-bioassay is giving it to yourself, reporting effects.
Yep. It's just another name for like a test.
Right. And when you're talking about s-MDMA, r-MDMA, in the development of one enantiomer over another, the right term here, analog, an example of this would be ketamine. And was it Johnson & Johnson proprietarized and released just the S enantiomer, called it S-ketamine, and had it approved for, depression, etc. And so listeners might be able to be like, oh, okay, that's kind of like, that's what S-ketamine is the S enantiomer of ketamine, which has an R and an S. Is that about right?
Exactly. That's exactly correct. Yes. And sometimes this is really just a trick for the companies to get a new patent and extend their ability to have exclusive rights on a molecule and, market it. But sometimes there are significant differences in the therapeutic value or the safety of the molecules. And so, it can be hard to tell which one is the case in a given molecule. A lot of the companies are focusing on MDMA itself. And my opinion is that I would be surprised if the R enantiomer ends up being really valuable therapeutically. And that's just because all the people I've heard who've tried it, so like Sasha Shulgin tried it, Rick Doblin's tried it, most of them have been underwhelmed by it in terms of the experience. And my hypothesis is that the experience of MDMA and entactogens is central to the therapeutic value. So there's all these companies making r-MDMA, and there is a company that's working on Methalone called Transcend Therapeutics.
And Methalone is also known as for MMC. Is that correct? For the
no, that's actually a mephedrone. So Methalone is bk-MDMA.
Okay, yeah.
And so bk-MDMA was something that Sasha and Peyton Jacob developed in the mid-90s. They had this idea, well, let's take MDMA and make it a cathinone-style molecule.
Which is just replacing the amphetamine with a cathinone. Cathinone?
It's taking this side chain and it's adding an oxygen sticking off of it, like really close to the ring.
Okay.
And if you do that, you tend to change like how fat soluble the molecule is, and you often end up needing a higher dose of the molecule, and it often doesn't last as long, so you get a shorter experience. But often they maintain a lot of the therapeutic or pharmacological effects. In the case of methalone, Sasha and Peyton described it more as like an antidepressant than an entactogen in their sort of original paper. And like Sasha seemed to think that it didn't quite have the magic of MDMA, but some people really seem to find value in it, particularly in higher doses.
My one experience with bk-MDMA definitely suggested to me that it was not as magical feeling as MDMA. Also, I had terrible cramps. I think that was related to my diet on the day, but yeah, my one experience was that it was very interesting, very curious, and very positive, but it didn't have that magical feeling. And I hadn't thought to put that language onto it till now. So thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the substances that seems to be getting a lot of popularity in the underground is 3-MMC. Is there any known development around that right now, or is that still sort of remaining underground or unknown, I guess?
There have been some patent applications filed on specific uses of 3-MMC. I would be surprised if it ever really gets seriously developed, because I think if you're going to develop 3-MMC, you might as well develop 4-MMC, which I think is probably in some ways better. But also, 4-MMC is a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Mm-hmm. And the way that the DEA interprets the Controlled Substances Act, they have a rule that anything that is a positional isomer of a Schedule 1 substance is also a Schedule 1 substance. So from the DEA's perspective, 3-MMC is also Schedule 1 in the US. And so I think that it doesn't prevent developing something as a medicine, but it certainly makes it more expensive and slower.
So that's actually what I learned in doing some of the research for this is coming to recognize that a Schedule 1 controlled substance doesn't mean banned from research. It just means it's so extremely expensive that it's effectively banned, because the vast majority of labs just cannot work on it because of how expensive it is to set up, to get licensing, and ultimately, from what I understand, to buy it from the DEA, because they have exorbitant prices to purchase this. And from what I understand, you have to buy it from them or from one of their certified labs, who are likely also paying lots of money in order to be able to make those products. Have I gotten that correct?
Mostly, I don't think you need to buy the substances from DEA, but everyone involved needs to have DEA permits.
Okay.
And so, it's just something that adds a lot of bureaucratic overhead and very much slows down the work. And so the result of that is you have, small numbers of labs that have already gotten the permits. Often they're labs that have been around for many, many years. And so if you go to that lab, it's not that hard to work with these substances, but it becomes difficult to set up your own lab as a new entity. And so it's almost as if there's like this high, barrier to overcome in terms of just, bureaucratic red tape and expense and time. And the side effect of that would be that it's not really a good idea for an academic researcher to start into this field without doing it by going to an existing lab.
Let's shift back a little bit to the entactogens as molecules and their sort of structures, what they do, and the development around them. As a company that's looking to develop, I don't know, an entactogen or some entactogens, what are some of the mechanisms that you are looking to sort of amplify or double down on? And what are some of the mechanisms from, say, known entactogens like bk-MDMA or MDMA that you're looking to avoid in development, and that could be subjective effects or pharmacological effects.
Sure, yeah. So there's a couple things that we're trying to dial down. One of them is with MDMA, people often feel like lower doses are, wasted or even sometimes anti-therapeutic. Many people have an experience that they feel weird, but not good at
That
lower
happened
doses.
to me on my last MDMA experience. I was just like kind of anxious and like a little flighty feeling, and I felt okay, but it's interesting that you should identify that. I actually haven't heard anyone else speak to that, so please continue.
Sure, yeah. So this kind of experience can make the therapy a little more difficult, because what you would want to do to avoid that is give a higher dose maybe, and then you're sort of always erring on the side of giving people higher doses. And if you do that, then you start to possibly risk this other phenomenon, which is loss of magic, as Sasha Shulgin named it, where people will experience decreasing therapeutic value from the experience.
Now, is that specifically from higher doses? Because from what I understand about that phenomenon is it has more to do with frequency of use than it does to be dosage. And from what I understand, the dosage question is more along the line of finding the optimal zone between like perceived benefit and detriments such as hangover, serotonin syndrome, these kinds of things. Can you deepen into that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah, that's a fair point. We don't really 100% know what the mechanism is here. I tried to get at this by collecting data from people online and just ask them a bunch of questions about their experience with MDMA and whether they felt like the effects had changed and whether they had this kind of loss of magic phenomenon. And we had about 600 people respond. And they had used, between like a very small number of MDMA, time. They'd used MDMA between a very small number of times and, hundreds of times. And about 40% said that they had this loss of magic phenomenon. And surprisingly, almost the same percent, a little under 40%, said that they did not have any decreasing therapeutic effects. And then there was people that weren't certain in the middle. Often those were people who hadn't used it many times. And the only thing that seemed to really predict the loss of magic that I could see there was just number of experiences. And dose didn't really seem like it mattered that much. And so that's
number of experiences total, not number of experiences in a defined time frame.
Yes. I didn't really get good data on sort of density of use, because that's very hard to do unless you use something like a calendar look back method where you sit down with someone and say, all right, well, let's just think about your entire career of using MDMA. Like, can you remember, like, do you use it around the holidays? What are kinds of days that you tend to use it? And then you can sort of like fill in a calendar, and then you have a pretty good thing. But if you just ask someone online, how often do you use? They sort of answer for, recent patterns, but they may kind of forget the fact that, at the beginning of their experiences with the compound, they might have like used really frequently. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a hard question to ask. So we didn't try. But yeah,
and not a lot of people, I've learned, unfortunately, recently, even know that it's a thing to not take too often. And so they might not have a mindset to be able to track the frequency. So in hindsight, they're like, I don't know, a handful of times, because they don't remember whether it was weekly or monthly or tri-monthly, every 3 months.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so there isn't great data on this. And one of the goals of the company is to really try and figure this out and get us a good answer so that we can understand how to preserve the magic. There was a paper that came out that was sort of a review of the work on people who've used MDMA many times. And so that at this point, there's been a number of studies where they've tried to use some kind of imaging technology to measure the density of people's serotonin transporter. And
which is where the MDMA molecule binds to. It binds to the transporter and increases the release of serotonin.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Like you can say it binds to the transporter, but really what it's doing is it's actually getting transported. It moves through the transporter to inside the cell. And then once it's inside the cell, it goes to these storage vesicles, which are these little kind of like mini storage areas that where the serotonin is, and it causes the serotonin to get released from there, and then the serotonin gets released through the transporter. So the transporter is one of the things that we know from animal studies. So the transporter gets decreased with higher repeated doses of MDMA, and along with serotonin itself and the enzyme, one of the enzymes that makes serotonin, tryptophan hydroxylase. And so if you're looking at animal studies with high doses, you do get decreases in a lot of serotonin-related proteins. And you might think that this could be part of the reason for loss of magic or some of the after effects, the lowered mood that people sometimes get a few days later. And there is a literature on trying to see if that kind of thing is happening in people. And the easiest way to do that is to try and take something that's radioactive that can stick to people's transporter, and then you can just measure the radioactivity in the brain and do a bunch of calculations and say, okay, this is how much transporter we think you have. And when you do that, there are studies that say MDMA users have lowered transporter. So this study that is probably like a year or two old now, combined the results from those different studies and said, well, let's just look at the relative level of transporter for these different papers and the average number of times people had used MDMA in the paper. And it does seem like there's a lowered serotonin transporter phenomenon, but that it maybe normalizes over time. And so, people who had used on the average something like 2 or 3 months ago had still lowered transporter, but then people had used on the average like a year ago seemed to have normal transporter.
And there's some proposition that this change in transporter density and enzymes and et cetera are responsible for the loss of magic, or that's responsible for something else that's unrelated to the loss of magic.
So the first thing I think would be a reasonable hypothesis. If MDMA has to get in through the transporter to cause serotonin release, and then you have less serotonin on the surface of your neurons, then MDMA is going to be less able to release serotonin. And then it'll still maybe release, you would expect it to still release dopamine and norepinephrine and do these other things, but the lack of the serotonin is going to make it feel very different. And so that's a reasonable theory.
Does MDMA also release dopamine and all these other things? Because from what I understood, it like just opened that gate wide and got everything funneling through. And once you're out of serotonin, it's like, yeah, whatever. Come on in, man. Dopamine, weird metabolites, just get in there. And things start getting the party all of a sudden starts to lose its vibe.
Yes. So yeah, first of all, MDMA will release dopamine and norepinephrine as well as it's releasing serotonin. And what you've just referred to is this fact that the serotonin transporter is a little, what we might say promiscuous. Will also transport some other things, including dopamine. And so one of the theories about why MDMA is kind of tough on your neurons in your brain is that when MDMA is causing serotonin release, it's also heating up the brain a little bit, and the increased temperature helps the transporter to be a little less selective and causes it to take in more dopamine than normal. And also there's more dopamine being released in some brain areas. And so you potentially are moving dopamine into your neurons, and dopamine is very easily oxidized. And then at the same time, you also have some MDMA metabolites that, are a little dopamine-ish in terms of them having like hydroxyl groups on the ring system. And so these things are fairly reactive. And once they're inside the neuron, they can potentially cause mischief and oxidize things.
So if I get this straight, it's kind of like a bouncer to the party. And the bouncer's like usually pretty straight and very clear that you got to have vibes. You give him a little bit of MDMA, just a little bit more opium. He's like, that's cool. Come in. You give him too much MDMA. He's not even paying attention. He's like chewing off. He's like, yeah, man, come on in. Yeah, everybody get in here. Yeah, it's good. The party's hot. Am I right? Or
That's perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And so we don't really know what's causing the loss of magic, but a reasonable theory might be that you've got less of the serotonin transporter and maybe also like less serotonin inside your neurons. And that ultimately, because of that, if you take more MDMA, you just can't release as much serotonin. And an important aspect of the MDMA experience is kind of the balance of release of these different neurotransmitters, the dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin.
Which is the magic space, is like,
Yeah,
it really feels like it's a certain space that you could either, like, the role, you're in it or you're not in it. And I can see what you're saying is, like, as the actual gates, the actual transporters are reduced, the ability for the brain to be stimulated into that space reduces. And so you're more likely to have the sort of other effects of MDMA that aren't that magical space, which are less desirable. It's more, I assume, like more stimulanty, a little bit more jarring, a little bit more of that sort of like, I'm not really in it. It doesn't really feel good energy.
exactly. Yeah. And so that's the theory that I would suggest is, best supported by the evidence. But, we have a lot more work to do before we really know that.
Now, I know that I sort of diverged. You were on a path of talking about what you're trying to sort of minimize in new entactogen development, and eventually you'll get into what you're trying to maximize. But I want to just lean a little bit more onto this loss of magic, because I really did want to ask you about it. I'm not sure if you're aware or what the research is on this. I know that qualitative or anecdotally, there's an emerging theory around N-acetylcysteine, NAC, as a supplement that increases brain levels of a strong antioxidant called glutathione. And there seems to be there's quite a substantial body of anecdotal evidence and maybe some peer-reviewed research, I can't remember, around it blocking the effects of various stimulants. So it would like block the effects of your ADHD medication, for example, or MDMA, like lessen it, but that there's a growing information around, well, if you take it for a significant amount of time, 6 months, and then you stop for 3 days, you can, even if you had lost the magic previously, you can get that magic back again. The theory being something along the lines of that sort of glutathione presence in the brain starts healing the oxidative damage that had been done to the brain, perhaps now based on the information you just said, increasing the density of transporters. Do you know much about that theory? Have you seen anything about that or know anything about it?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, anecdotally, people are reporting that they can sometimes, restore the magic by taking NAC. And the thing is that there are other people who say they tried it and it didn't work for them. So we don't really have full clarity as to what percent of the time this is helpful for people. Certainly, it seems worth trying. And acetylcysteine, is a glutathione precursor, and glutathione is a really important antioxidant. But it also seems to do something in terms of helping to normalize neuroplasticity, specifically regarding the glutamate system. And this has been seen and studied after stimulant exposure. I think the first time I saw a paper on this was with cocaine, and there's a little bit with amphetamines as well. And so there is this literature looking at whether NAC might be helpful for people who have had a substance use disorder in the past, and maybe the stimulants have kind of pushed their plasticity system in a real far direction, and now it's not really normalized. And there's some evidence that NAC can help normalize it. And so it might be, if it is actually helpful for people, that this could be the pathway, that it's somehow helping the brain to become more adaptive. Because, if you've taken MDMA a bunch of times and, you last took it like, weeks or months ago, there's probably not a whole lot of oxidative damage that's actually in your brain or anything. It's probably more that what's happened is there's a balance of regulation that your brain has where, it makes serotonin, it releases it, and then it, recycles some of it by taking it back through the serotonin transporter and repackages it for storage, and then it releases it again. And there's some kind of sensing mechanism for when you need more serotonin. That's, and then you have tryptophan hydroxylase, that's an enzyme that helps make it. And a lot of this stuff is happening either like at the synapse, if there's really a synapse here, but sort of at the ends of the cell. Like you've got these, extensions from the cell body that are going throughout the brain, and the serotonin is getting released, like in these far-flung regions away from the cell bodies. And so these far-flung regions are dependent on various, things being transported along the axon to the far-flung reaches. And what happens with MDMA potentially is that you get the serotonin is decreased, the enzyme is decreased, the transporter is decreased, and so there may be kind of a sort of low activity state that it gets stuck in. And it could be the case that enhancing plasticity might help to push it back into like a higher activity state. And this is me speculating, but
so something like our body has a homeostatic system, and it will respond to things in order to keep it in a kind of homeostasis. And depending on what the stimulus is, the homeostasis changes could be positive or could be negative. Like, for example, if I take, Concerta or some sort of methylphenidate every single day, eventually I'll have to take more of it because my body is normalizing to a certain presence of dopamine and norepinephrine because of the effects of the drug. And then if I just stop taking it, I'm going to feel like absolute garbage because my brain's like, oh, I've actually optimized to having a certain level of these what's the term, catecholamines in my brain, and without it, and so I'm not producing enough to compensate for that. So without the drug, I'm like super low. And what you're suggesting is something to the effect that like all this MDMA use can make it so that the brain's like, okay, actually we're getting too much MDMA because we have too many of these transporter gates. So let's like trim those down. But something about that also creates a damage in the brain's capacity to then upregulate, like bring those transporters back once there's no longer a presence of the drug. And so it's almost like it's, pushing the brain into this lower density of transporter gates, and then the plasticity gets stuck that it can't sort of bounce its way back. And what you're saying is that perhaps theoretically the NAC helps change the neuroplasticity capacity of the brain. So it could go, oh, wait a minute, we're not taking MDMA anymore. We could actually up level these transporter gates again. Like, let's do that. And then that might theoretically result in the next time you take MDMA, more transporter gate, more magic. Did I kind of catch that?
Yeah. And so again, this is a theory, but
of course, yeah.
I think it's pretty plausible. And it does seem like the brain can potentially get stuck in this sort of low serotonin activity state. And then the question is, how do you push it back up? And there's not that much in the literature that would give us guidance on this. One of the only things I do know is that aerobic exercise does seem like it upregulates the serotonin system. And so that might be useful for people as well who want to recover the magic of MDMA. So
drop a big dose of NAC and get on that treadmill and just push it to a reasonable amount of degree, to 20 to 30 minutes multiple times a week or something to this effect. Okay, that's great. If there isn't anything more you want to say on that, let's get back onto the thread you were talking about around drug development and what you're trying to get less of. So for example, you were saying this sort of dangers of too high a dose, or the issues of the dose not being high enough, creating non-ideal circumstances for therapy, sort of changing that scenario so it's easier to get into the ideal zone from a dose perspective without risk is one of the things that you're sort of going for. What else are you trying to avoid or sort of shoot for in the development of an entactogen for therapeutic purposes?
Yep. Yeah. So for me, the perfect entactogen would, as we said, avoid this kind of weird sort of come up are sort of underdosing phenomenon. And so ideally you'd be able to take a quarter dose and feel like the same experience, but just it's just essentially a quarter as strong. We would like to avoid this loss of magic or diminished therapeutic effects. If you're only ever going to need MDMA therapy, once in your life in 3 sessions to treat, one specific trauma, that's great. But we expect that this will be something people find valuable, and it would be really nice to be able to, go to it as needed throughout one's life as different issues come up.
Sure, like any kind of therapy. It's like, I really needed it for about 6 months there, and then for 4 months I didn't, and then at some point I needed to go again once a week, and to be able to know that you're going to be able to step into the same waters, or relatively the same waters.
Yep, absolutely. And then this other thing is people sometimes feel emotionally sensitive and vulnerable, or sometimes even have a depressed mood several days after MDMA use. And this isn't something that's been recorded in the clinical trials all that much yet. And so there's some skepticism as to whether it's really caused when if you took pure MDMA in a therapeutic setting, would you really get this? And I think the answer is yes. And I think we just haven't really established that, mostly because people in the clinical trials with patients have a high level of anxiety and sort of negative mood already, and that fluctuates a lot. And so this might be masked in those people. And also, I think that this experience seems like it might become more likely the more you use MDMA. And so, sort of early in your MDMA use career, you're more likely to have afterglows, but then people later on start to maybe feel like the negative effects get worse.
Gloomy Tuesday.
Yeah. And so that'd be something that would be very nice to dial down as much as possible. And then the other thing that we're really focused on is just the cardiovascular effects. So, for most people, if you're young and healthy, then like an increase in blood pressure and heart rate isn't a big deal. But, if you want to use this as a medicine in older patients, or people with, existing cardiovascular issues, then this can be something that's a real safety issue. And in general, my goal with this class of medicine is to make something that would be gentle enough that you could use it without safety monitoring. So in a perfect world, we'd have something that's a prescription medicine that you could be prescribed to take at home, maybe take it with a partner and work through some issues and things like that. And a medicine that relatively unpredictably causes, significant hypertension and, heart rate increases doesn't really fit the profile of an at-home medicine. And so we're trying to dial that down.
This is the same with MDMA, bk-MDMA, and these other ones that are being developed as well, all sort of have this concern about cardiovascular health issues, or is this just specifically you've noticed this with MDMA?
I think it's more prominent with MDMA. With bk-MDMA, it doesn't seem like it's as much of an issue, but again, the sort of magical feeling of MDMA doesn't seem as prominent with bk-MDMA, and sometimes people take higher doses to try and get it. And I'm not really certain we really know the blood pressure and heart rate effects of these higher doses.
Okay, and to clarify, when you're talking about you're not necessarily talking about the larger scientific community. You're talking specifically about Tactogen's goals in drug development, at least as well. And you had said something around the idea of a safe and predictable enough therapeutic medication that it could be prescribed as a take-home, to develop a kind of, not exactly, but a kind of take-home MDMA that you don't have to spend whatever thousands of dollars it's likely going to cost to get MDMA therapy. Why do you think that that's an important goal set? Mind you might have had other things that you're trying to optimize first, so we could maybe go there first, and then we could go back. But I'm curious why creating a take-home style entactogen therapy is important to you, and also you feel is relevant to the therapeutic scene.
Sure, yeah. So there's 2 aspects to that. One of them is accessibility, and as you alluded to, the sort of Stangroff derived therapeutic approach where you have, two therapists in the room with you while you're taking the medicine, and it's, in this, professional context maybe, is very expensive, and it's very time consuming. Particularly, if you're someone who lives in rural America, there's not going to be an MDMA therapy clinic nearby. Mm-hmm. You're going to travel several hours. If you don't own a car, that's going to be a huge, long trip to get there. And then you're going to have to be there for, at least 8 hours and then travel back. And that's not the kind of thing that most people are going to be able to fit into their lives. And so something that you could take at home, potentially makes it something that's just less expensive and costs less in terms of time, and becomes something that can be accessed by everyone. And so accessibility is really important. The other aspect of this is I don't think we really know how to best use this class of medicine yet. And this, for example, what we're doing now, we sort of in drug development with MDMA and with psychedelics, the standard model is this kind of Stan Grof-derived model where you have people listen to music with eye shades on. So it's kind of an inward focused journey.
Sure. Two therapists on hand at all times, a male and a female. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, that approach was originally developed with LSD and psychedelics that are classical psychedelics. MDMA is a very different mechanism of action. And so it's an open question as to whether this is the optimal sort of therapeutic approach. And we do know that lots of people find value from experiences that are in a different context. Some people do sort of solo therapy journeys. Some people, do body work or journaling or just talking with someone. There's a whole,
say just with a small group of friends or with your partner. Yeah, you don't necessarily want a therapist standing there ready to hold your hand. You need to hold each other's hands and be able to just speak to each other.
Exactly, and so what we'd like to do is enable all that kind of use of these molecules and not really close anything off or make it difficult. And so to do this, we're going to have to get the green light from FDA. And so the way we think about this is there's sort of two issues. One is safety and the other is efficacy. And so on the safety front, the concern is going to be, is it really safe for people to take this at home? And, it's an empirical question, and we'll collect the data, and hopefully the answer is yes. And then the second question is efficacy. Do people still have a therapeutic outcome that's, significant enough that it's worth doing outside of this, classic context? And so we think that that's an empirical question. And so we could collect the data, and we expect the answer is going to be yes.
Mm. So something I'm thinking about is another issue, I think, that you didn't speak to there, which is morality issue, an issue of paradigm. Because you're talking about, so drugs to treat issues. So depression, anxiety, I'm going through a hard time again, and so on and so forth. But you're also talking about substances that make, for the not all the time, but ultimately what you're going for is a positive experience. And it's not just I'm back to baseline. It's I'm in a literally, we use the term magical. We're in this magical place, and we're ideally optimizing to get in there and revel in that with ourselves and with others, and maybe touch difficult things, but also touch positive things. And so in the same way that it's psychedelics can't be medicine until we make the psychedelic effects go away, because the hallucination is wrong and bad, right? That's why fluoxetine was okay to develop, but LSD had to be the door shut down on that really hard, right? So we're coming into this issue of there being something wrong with feeling good. And so when you're talking about the development of a take-home medicine, we go into this whole realm of starting to cross the edge of what's recreational. Can I go to my doctor and say I'm just feeling like me and my wife we're just kind of butting heads a lot. I'm wondering if you could prescribe us some insert Tactogen's developed drug here in order for us to have a few really positive weekends together. What's the difference between that and being like, I kind of feel like I'd like to have a positive weekend right now because I feel like it'd be nice to have a good time. So I'm going to go to the store and buy this thing. Like in Canada, I can go to the store right now and be like, yep, I'd like a 10 and 10 milligrams CBD THC bevy for the evening, going to watch a movie with my friend, have a good time. So I'm wondering about the challenge of approaching that sort of like moralism against hedonism or something. Is that something that you're thinking about, that you're tracking? If so, what are your thoughts? If not, what are your thoughts?
So the first thing I would say is that we're working within the system that's given to us. And so to get this kind of medicine approved, we're going to go through the different regulators, FDA, the EMA in Europe and in other countries, and we have to be responsive to their concerns. And one of their concerns is abuse liability, where they're a little more reluctant and they'll look a little more closely at compounds that seem to be fun, seem to have abuse liability. But the truth is that MDMA itself doesn't have as high abuse liability as amphetamine or methamphetamine. It's higher than water or something, but it's not that high. And so if stimulants are approvable and if benzodiazepines are approvable, then MDMA should be approvable too. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of molecules that one could make that would be even a little less fun than MDMA, but still provide a lot of value. One of the things that can happen with MDMA is that the fun can be sometimes distracting from the therapeutic intent.
Yeah.
Like you can get into this sort of pleasure mode instead of doing the thing that you were originally intending to do. But all that aside, I do think that it's important for people to have fun, to have good times. And I think that is healing in and of itself.
Right. I was thinking that when you said, sometimes you can get distracted from your therapeutic effect because you're just having this really positive experience about something else. And I'm like, yep, that's definitely true. And in some sense, it could be a kind of, a defense mechanism coming up. You're like, nah, why deal with the dark stuff? Let's wander through this meadow or whatever. And yet also that positive experience itself is a kind of medicine, right? A medicine that I feel like a lot of us are missing. It's just like access to embodied joy that isn't screen mediated, which I guess isn't all that embodied. But yeah, anyways, that was my commentary. Please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So like, if you've got some chronic pain and you take an analgesic, maybe an anti-inflammatory, and the pain goes away, that's just a good thing. And maybe if it's an acute injury or even a chronic injury, that you could do some PT and like work through the injury and, strengthen the tissue around it and just kind of do some motion that helps there to get blood flow and, things into that area while you're on this analgesic, then it can have a, therapeutic benefit. And, in some ways, I think of entactogens as being a little bit like this, where they put you in this state where you can work on this thing with decreased discomfort. And then the end result is that you have sort of increased range of experiential motion afterwards. But we wouldn't say that, someone who just takes the anti-inflammatory so that, it kind of pushes the pain, down. Like we wouldn't say that that's a bad thing to do, but we do need a balance where we're not creating a situation where the people become dependent or, have some sort of loss of control. And ultimately the thing that we were hoping would help free them just gets them stuck in a different situation.
Sure,
and so I think that's
or because they're taking this anti-inflammatory all the time, they're doing things that are actually making the problem worse.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the balance that in theory we're all trying to draw when there's all these regulations about this kind of stuff. And the other thing I would say about this is that one likely side effect of getting a medicine approved that's inexpensive would be that even if a use of the medicine isn't approved and would be thus off-label and thus not covered by insurance, it might not be prohibitively expensive. And so, as your listeners may know, when you get a medicine approved, it's approved for some indication. So MDMA is going to be approved for post-traumatic stress disorder, or more precisely, it's going to be approved for, to assist therapy for psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. We have reason to believe that it may also be useful for some other things, maybe like social anxiety, maybe alcohol use disorder, maybe body dysmorphia and eating disorders, maybe adjustment disorder, maybe just working through relationship difficulties with someone. Those won't be covered by insurance because the medicine isn't approved for those purposes, but
that would qualify it as off-label use.
Yes, and that would be called off-label use. And so it's possible that that'll be something where a physician could just say, well, this will be off-label, so your insurance won't cover it, but I'm still going to write you a prescription for this, and we'll still do the MDMA therapy for your social anxiety or your alcohol use disorder. There's a little bit of question there in terms of what's called the REMS, which is the FDA term that stands for risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, because when medicines are approved that seem like they've got some kind of like extra risks associated with them, the drug manufacturer, in this case MAPS, PBC, and the FDA will work out some like sort of extra vigilance, extra procedures for ensuring that things don't go wrong. And it may be that some of that stuff might make it more difficult to do off-label prescribing. But, in most cases, you expect that physicians will be able to do off-label prescribing. And so if we are able to get a medicine approved for take-home use, and we're able to show that that's safe and also it has significant therapeutic value, then it might not be too expensive for physicians to prescribe that off-label for other purposes, including, reconnecting with your partner. And so that's kind of like the big picture idea that we're working with.
Now, do you still think that there's going to be, like you're talking specifically for I think the word I'm looking for is like the pipeline, the regulatory pipeline, and the sort of challenges that will be present in that. But do you think that you're still going to face a kind of moral backlash around sort of like good feel medicines? From what I understand, this continues to be, less so now, but still a bit of a backlash with psychedelics having hallucinogenic effects. It was I imagine, quite a backlash for cannabis. The only way cannabis first got use is because it has to be treating something that is horrible so you can get back to baseline. And, fast forward, whatever it was, 70 years or something like that. When did cannabis get criminalized? The 50s or something to this effect? So fast forward all this time and all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, you could also just use it to feel good, I guess. That's all right. Because the drugs that we generally have now that are okay for recreational use, at home use, free, you're an adult, make your own damn decisions use, are drugs that stimulate productivity or in the sort of economic field. Yep, you can manage your stress and get work done by smoking, drinking coffee, these kinds of things, taking antidepressants so that you're not actually feeling the real emotional consequences of the life that you've been either forced to live based in your past before you were an adult, or the life that you're forced to live as a context of socioeconomic expectations and confines. Or you could take a drug that makes it so that you don't have to think about those things, which is alcohol. And all these other drugs, oh, no, they're bad because so on and so forth. And I think there seems to be a push against that kind of, moral is not an essential. I'm not saying there is a morality, but a kind of like cultural morality that needs to be pushed and challenged, a paradigm that needs to be challenged in that respect. Do you feel like you're going to have to challenge those paradigms as well as running through the legislative regulatory pipeline as well?
I think it's a good question, and of course, we're just going to have to see what happens. My read on the situation is that the sort of the enthusiasm for non hallucinogenic psychoplastogens that are derived from psychedelics is that it's not about fun, because the people that are trying to do it are by and large aware that psychedelics aren't reliably fun. Like they're it's more about reducing cost and the fact that regulators are a little kind of feeling worried and risk averse about these compounds. It's just a fact that if we increase access to psychedelics, we are going to have people who have difficult experiences. And, some of them are going to be quite terrifying and cause the person to have to do a lot of sort of restabilizing.
Sure. And the context in which they have that experience isn't necessarily going to be resilient enough to support them in making good sense of that, because like the sort of fast explosion of therapy training isn't going to have the kind of time frame and what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of robust history to allow these therapists to really support people in these experiences that they themselves are probably not expecting.
Yep. Absolutely. And in addition to that, we really think of these things as being like problems that are localized within the individual that need to be managed by this individual therapist. Whereas it's plausible that we should be thinking about these more as systemic social issues. You get depressed not just because of something that's happening in your brain, but because of the situation that exists in your life. And as long as we kind of try to isolate people and fix them as like just these isolated units, and don't say, hey, let's also try to fix your life, we're not going to really make great progress, I think. And so I do think that some of the hesitancy about these substances isn't so much an anti-fun component, but it's more just society and especially bureaucracies have fear about what's going to happen, and some of the fear has good grounds. And so it's a lot easier to say, oh, if we get rid of the unpredictable, intense experience part, then, sure, we can approve it. But if you include the unpredictable, intense experience part where people might have this, significant terror, then they're a little going to be foot dragging about it. Because what we've seen with amphetamines, and admittedly, amphetamines now aren't really sort of the preferred therapeutic class in some ways, and increasingly we're trying to find, we as a society are trying to find medicines for ADHD that aren't really classical amphetamines.
What's it called? Amoxicillin, Strattera, I think is the brand name.
Strattera,
or bupropion, Wellbutrin, these things that are non-stimulant type treatments for the deficit. I'm using air quotes.
Yeah, exactly. But what we've seen over time with amphetamine is we kind of as a society have, especially with medicine, have stopped talking about euphoric qualities of it. Amphetamines were antidepressants and were essentially used as antidepressants when they were first discovered. But we've now transitioned into talking about their effects on attention, and then abuse liability concerns are the only place where the sort of euphoria still gets really addressed. And so, apparently society and, the medical system has a great capacity to sort of recontextualize and redefine things when it wants to.
Sure,
and so it's possible
without having to change its mind, it just changes the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can totally see that happening here too. I mean, I'm not confident that that's going to happen, but I think it's a possibility. And so as cannabis becomes more accepted medically, you sort of like, you have plausibly less concerns about, whatever, like people becoming slackers just because they use cannabis. And you have less concerns about, whatever, like the munchies or music sounding too good or whatever the concerns were in the past.
We're trying to suppress the consumption of Pink Floyd in our society. Just get people real high and put the wall on. That'll send them through a loop. They won't want to do that again. Anyways, please continue.
No, I think that's more or less all I had to say on that. That's there is some anti-fun elements, but society can also just recontextualize the fun and move forward. And we do have lots and lots of medicines that are approved that do have some abuse liability, but we are able to balance the fact that they have therapeutic value with the risks of people ending up in a problematic use situation with them.
This is a very reasonable perspective. I'm going to reject all of it and just perceive everyone that doesn't like me taking drugs as stick up their ass fun police. No,
I mean, I think the more serious aspect is that once you do have any of these laws in place, like once, our big mistake was making the enforcement of this something that essentially, law enforcement does. And, putting the DEA central to like drug regulation decisions and drug regulation enforcement. And so once you have laws that are being enforced by law enforcement, then there's this ability to use this to essentially, maintain all these, social injustices.
Sure. And so it also allows to maintain a certain profitability. Harry J. Anslinger, the guy who's basically responsible for cannabis prohibition, the guy that was behind pushing the reefer madness agenda and all this stuff, fervent racist. He was losing his position because alcohol prohibition was ending. And so he utilized the sort of like racist fears of society at the time to push this evil thing called marijuana, which wasn't even what it was called, even though most of the states grew hemp and used hemp. And it was all this thing in order to maintain his position, because otherwise he was going to lose his job. And so there's a profitability there too. Like the DEA, if they continue to make all these drugs illegal, then they have justification to increase, jobs, but also profit funding. Police districts get increased funding because this drug problem is out of control. We need fucking tanks. These meth heads, they can lift cars. We need tanks now, So it's like, and then on top of that, there's a big issue from what I understand, the prison industrial complex, and then mix that up with these, social injustices and the ongoing issues of implicit racism in prejudice, but also in systemic, in like the system structure of a thing. And we have a situation where maintaining this prohibition model causes a lot of harm at the profit of a select group, not a specific group, but a select collection of groups of people. And it creates the very problems it's proposing to solve. Was that coherent, that little track that I went on? Yeah.
I'm 100% with you. Absolutely. And it always seems like no matter how much this approach fails to solve the problem it's purporting to solve, the solution is to always put more funding into this approach.
More criminalization, right?
Yeah.
I do appreciate the shift. It's happening in Canada more. And there's some issues with how this shift is coming about. All of a sudden, so many people are dying from fentanyl that they can't hide it from the news anymore. And it's also like white suburban kids now. So it's a real problem, so we really got to talk to our regulators now, because the people who look like us are now the ones that are dying or something to this effect. So I have a lot of issues with that, but there is this push towards like, substance use disorder is a medical issue. It's not a legal issue. Possession of substances for their use, even their problematic use, is a medical issue. It's not a judicial issue or a criminal issue. And this, I think, is a positive shift, even if it's coming from a bit of a weird scenario from the public mind, right? Yeah. So I'm glad that there is a sort of shifting in that. I don't know if it's shifting as much in the US as it is here in Canada.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that it will accelerate. The decriminalization and sane approaches to drug policy seem like they're getting a foothold locally in states and in cities and um, local governments in general. And I think that that's a real bright spot in kind of a complex landscape of politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm optimistic about this.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try to slow my roll a little bit. I'm getting a little hot on this issue. I might have interrupted you where you're going somewhere, and I don't remember now. I want to go back to something. I had an in. Let's see if I can find that in. I think earlier, I want to get into how companies are conducting themselves, essentially, like some of the concerns in the industry. Here it is. So you had spoken to this issue around it's a paradigm issue of thinking like, oh, the problem with a person's illness is in the individual. We could take that to a whole other level and say, well, it's a problem of the brain that's expressing in the individual and blah, 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 this sort of biological psychiatry model of illness. But just focusing on this idea of like, oh, the issue's in the individual. So we need to fix the individual so that they can go back into society, rather than recognizing, well, the problem is that society is kind of set up in a way to make people sick. And some of those people express their sickness in ways that we recognize, such as depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, et cetera, et cetera. Others express this illness in ways that we, in a weird, distorted way, called success, such as like becoming billionaires or, like bringing good quarterly profits for your fossil fuel stakeholders, and so on and so forth. And there's this discussion in the psychedelic industrial process, the psychedelic culture, which is saying like, if we just take these drugs and port them into a system that is making people sick and expect that these drugs are just going to make people better, it's not going to work that way. Like, we can't just take a sickening system and put something that might help a person and give it to them and expect that that's going to make the person better. We have to flip it around and say, hey, we have to create a different way of engaging with people in therapeutic alliance and sort of therapeutic providing the therapy itself, so that the system itself shifts in order to stop making people sick. And so with that in mind, there's this sort of like, well, let's not just legalize psychedelics, but let's like psychedelicize the legal system or something to the effect of, let's not make psychedelics a psychiatric practice, but let's psychedelicize psychiatry so that it's all more effective and psychedelics can fit inside of it. With respect to the industry, the biotech industry, psychedelic drug development industry, psychedelic therapy industry, there's quite a few examples of companies sort of doing the thing that makes people sick with psychedelics and hoping to profit off it. And then there are some examples of companies that are trying to do something different. Now, from what I understand, Tactogen is doing something different. And I'll ask you about that in a second. But first off, maybe you can give us a lay of the landscape that you're seeing in the sort of biotech psychedelic industrialization process that you might see as problematic moves in the industry with respect to this idea that psychedelics could actually provide something really positive to the individual and to society, if anything at all.
Yeah, that's a big question. And I confess I don't pay super close attention to all the moves that psychedelic medicine companies are making. The way I think about this is that a lot of these, the biotech companies whose names we've heard, the psychedelic medicine companies whose names we've heard, are largely companies that went public really quickly. And going public really quickly is really atypical for a biotech company or a pharma company. And it suggests that early investors wanted to be able to exit quickly. and didn't have a lot of confidence in the long-term prospects of the project, and that essentially they wanted to transfer risk from the insiders to the retail investors. And so I don't think that most of the companies that are well known are really serious efforts to fully leverage the possibility of psychedelics. And so I only kind of keep like a light sort of eye on what they're doing. I, by and large, think that attempts to get classical psychedelics approved as medicines will have, a little bit of value to some people. There will be some people who will best experience the therapeutic effects of these medicines in a real clinical context, and who have the right adequate health care to be able to access it. But I really think that the system we're going to see is increasingly going to be one where we have ultimately competition between decriminalized experiences and experiences like are what's going to become available in Oregon soon that are not really a medical system. You don't need a prescription and an indication. That's sort of on-demand psychedelic experiences. And as these sorts of things become easier to access, it becomes something where you're like, well, I could try to get a prescription and get insurance to cover this treatment, or I could go to a retreat in Jamaica, or I could just drive up to Oregon, or I could, go to Santa Cruz where it's decriminalized. And because of that level of competition, I really don't think that these psychedelic companies are going to end up being big companies with a lot of influence on how the overall ecosystem develops. This is my hope, at least. And this is what I'm guessing is going to happen. And that's, this is in part why Tactogen is focused on MDMA-like compounds, because we think that there's substantial room for improvement on these things. There aren't natural sources of entactogens. And so even if you wanted to decriminalize MDMA, which some places are doing, you're always going to need, pure chemical medicine that's been produced with high standards, so its identity and its purity. And that's not something that's really going to be the kind of thing that Santa Cruz or even the state of Oregon would want to ever take on as part of their regulatory process. And so that's almost certainly going to have to be something that continues to be regulated at a federal level. So, even in the world in which you have over-the-counter entactogens that you could just buy in a store, there's going to have to be a lot of work done to ensure that the contents of what you're buying are what it says on the label. And so by focusing on entactogens, there's room for improvement, and also it gives us something where the interests of this company as a project is never sort of out of alignment with work that people are doing to decriminalize and legalize and sort of make the laws less repressive.
Sure. Because, this is what you meant in our prep call when you said something to the effect of that your Tactogen's goals, you want to ensure that it's never antagonistic with the goals of the larger psychedelic community.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there are bad actor companies out there, but there, I think, attempts to kind of extract some money from people's enthusiasm for the possibilities of psychedelics, and I don't think they're going to ever be that big or important.
So I have two other things that I want to ask you about with respect to the direction of the industry, which are concerning, and then also something that The second one is a little bit more like what Tactogen is doing that's slightly different. The first one is around patent trolling. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on that. I imagine anyone that's been paying attention to the industry probably already has a sense of that, so maybe you don't have to go too deep into it. But I know that that is another issue that is presently happening that's affecting that is impacting the landscape of the psychedelic industry, therapeutic and biotech.
Sure, yeah. So in general, there's a lot of encouragement and pressure to get patents if you're a company. The sort of minimal thing that it does is it helps ensure that you have freedom to operate. But also patents can be seen as an asset that have value. And so you could potentially license out your IP. And so all these companies that are trying to raise money from investors are also thinking, oh, how can we get some patents so it looks like we have freedom to operate and looks like we have valuable assets? Because of those pressures, you see a lot of patents written that are bad patents. And there's a number of ways in which they can be bad. Some of them are just things that are just not going to ever succeed in turning into an awarded patent because
like Compass Pathways, I heard trying to patent holding your client's hand during psilocybin therapy, like this kind of thing.
Yeah, things like that have strong prior art where it's already like a easily discoverable fact that this was something that people were already doing. So there's that kind of thing. And often you'll see early stage companies announce they filed a patent application, but not like really give much details beyond that. And that's a way to kind of keep them in the press and make it seem like they're being productive and that they have something valuable. But then once the patent publishes, you look at it and you're like, yeah, that's not going to turn into a real patent. That's just a failure right there. And you were just doing it to get a press release out. So we see a fair amount of that kind of thing. But then there is this practice when you write a patent of trying to kind of claim as big a space as you can. And the reason to do that, if you're a company, would be because you want to discourage competition. And so, it's like, why not like ask for more than you actually need? And that way it'll be harder for other companies to come in. And you can almost see it like a company is like an explorer that comes to what they think is a new continent and they're claiming land. And they're just like, oh, we're going to claim all this land. And, they're ignoring the fact that people have already been there and that this isn't a real discovery, but they're relying on the fact that the patent system may not be fully aware that people are there. Because the patent system, just has the information of what's, easily findable in the patent system.
It's funny that you said it's like that. To me, it's not like that. It is that. It's that same thing, just, continued on and pointed in a different direction. That's my take on it. But yeah, continue.
Yeah. I think it's very similar to that. I'm hesitant to say it is that because while there are this sort of colonialism aspects to this kind of IP claiming, in some cases, the people who are already on the land are themselves colonizers too, and so it's a more complex situation, of course. But I think the basic image I think holds true. So you have this tendency when you're writing a patent, your patent attorney who helps you write the thing will always want to like claim more than you actually think you need and then that you actually did. And so instead of claiming a single molecule, typically you'll like claim this sort of family of molecules. And that's, sort of standard practice. And if you don't want to do that, you have to kind of push back against the people who are helping you write patents. And So that's essentially stuff that's the way the system will just work. And those are sort of the minor kinds of abuses of the system. But the more egregious ones are ones where people just like claim things that are like hand holding or, soft lighting and comfy furniture and things that are just standard practice, but they're just going to, claim that they invented it and see if it gets accepted by the patent office. And so that's what we see with the DMT vape pen thing, where there's, been a patent awarded for vaping DMT and some other molecules. And so now, some patent attorney dude in, I think, Seattle has a patent on this, even though it was a widely practiced thing for many years beforehand.
Mm. Now, could this hold, now that actually gets into my other thing that I wanted to say, but are these kinds of awarded patents, are these subject to, say, if there was some sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, collection of people that all sort of put legal action, could legal action be taken against this awarded patent to say no, actually, that's not your original idea. Here's the evidence that it's been going on for a while. It was widely used. These other companies were doing it. You don't actually have any history in the development of this. You stole this idea from what was effectively public domain before it was patented. Are those types of legal actions possible, B, viable?
I believe they are, but I think it's expensive. And so the best approach is to intervene before the patent is awarded. And that's what Porta Sophia is trying to do. They're trying to, this is an organization that's attempting to keep an eye on the patent process and flagging ones that will be bad patents because there is prior art. And then they try to intervene in the process and get the patent scaled back to whatever is actually a reasonable thing to claim.
So, unless I'm interrupting you, I said that this goes into my second question. Now, that you wrote an article that was published on Chacruna, the name of which is escaping me at this time, and you talked about Maria Sabina and R. Gordon Wasson as an example of some things that are happening in the space now. I think you concluded with something like, I think a quote, "He made mushrooms more available, but healthcare less effective. Let's not repeat that mistake today." Very cool article. I'll ask you if you want to comment on that at the very end, but specifically, you talked about this scenario wherein companies are extracting value from a kind of commons. This is my language. They're going in. There's actually a lot of work that's been done over the past decades that say, yes, safe and effective, and these are the drugs that seem to be working the best, and these are the way that people are taking these drugs, and these are the experiences that they're having, and all of this is actually information that's publicly available online that has been developed grassroots through community, and they're coming in, they're utilizing that information to create, to direct and target their company, or they're using it to support and validate certain claims or certain research, and doing so at the expense, they're using this public information, but they're not giving back at all to the psychedelic users. And in the same article, you say something to the quote, "Companies developing psychedelic medicines should recognize psychedelic users as stakeholders and create processes for including them," end quote. I'm wondering if you can comment on that a little bit and where you see your choices with Tactogen fitting into your sort of attempt to address this issue.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, thanks for reading the article and mentioning it to your listeners. So what Tactogen has done so far is we had a community stakeholder initiative that just ended a couple weeks ago now, and it was an opportunity for people who felt aligned with our mission to invest in the company. And normally, if you're just an average schmo like you or me, you wouldn't have an opportunity to invest in a company until it's gone public. And at that point, often most of the increase in value of the company has already occurred, and you're sort of at this point where it's sort of uncertain and random whether it's going to go up or down or what. So
that's assuming it's not one of those companies that was trying to use hype to up an exit strategy. Companies that are actually in it for the long haul.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And so even companies that seem like they're in it for the long haul, like, I think Compass really is trying to develop psilocybin as a medicine. They're very much down right now. And there's no telling what's going to happen. And so that's one thing that we've done is we've opened up the opportunity for, community stakeholders to become involved as investors. We're additionally interested in having a drug development process that includes a community of experts in helping us to make some decisions about our clinical trials and the approach that we're taking to moving this medicine forward. And so to just say a little bit more about that, we believe that there are a lot of different sort of types of therapeutic support or container that could help people to have a reliable, good outcome with an entactogen. And we would like to do a study in phase 2 where we pair our medicine with different types of therapeutic practices, and then we can measure the benefits and, of course, assess the costs and things like that, and ultimately, hopefully, go to FDA with this sort of, collection of different approaches and evidence for their value, and say, hey, we think that aside from this classic, clinical, therapeutic container with 2 therapists, we think that these other things are also useful, and here's the evidence.
Oh, so like opening more doors through the legislative pathway than just like, yep, you can have it, but it has to be 2 therapists, heavily treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's a little bit like you're using the actual drug development program as an opportunity to open more doors at the end. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think MAPS would like to have been able to do something like that, but because they were first, they were very much resource constrained. And so their hope is that they'll get approved with this, kind of one model, and then they'll encourage studies of pairing MDMA with other types of therapeutic approaches and then build an evidence base there. And we'd like to essentially try to do that earlier in the process. And I'm not an expert on all the types of helpful practices that people have used with these medicines. And so that's going to be a point at which we're going to try and draw on a community of experts in order to really ensure that we're doing the right thing there. And in general, our goal is to use our community in order to ensure that we're really solving the right problems. And, getting back to what you said earlier, we would love to, and we will work to get the medicine approved in a way that it doesn't naturally fall into just being an approved medicine in the system as it is now, but we would like to get it approved in a way that it is natural and easy to use the medicine to help people connect in communities and to make it so that you aren't an isolated, consumer, but that part of the process of making more resilient individuals is making more resilient communities. And how can we build that into our drug development process? And, like you said, we can't just medicalize psychedelics. We have to psychedelicize medicine.
That's beautiful. That's very much like in my mind, that's sort of the vision I had, almost like instead of it, it's like of like the imagery of a river, a river flows and then it sort of, when it gets out into the ocean, it starts to create like to become a delta, right? And like really opens the doors for all this flow of water into the ocean. And sort of the difference between that and just like a drainage pipe that just goes down into the ocean. don't know, and the ocean is where money is made. I don't know what it is, but
totally, yeah. And the delta is an ecosystem where like all kinds of life forms can thrive, and there's just this diversity of beings and behaviors that you're not going to get if you're just dumping from a pipe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and see, and besides being very curious about, you know, picking your brain about entactogens in general, which was the first, you know, 2/3, 3/4 of this interview. This is one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show, was because the more I learned about tactogen, the more I felt like, oh, this is the kind of work, these are the kind of voices that I personally want to amplify more in the sort of larger scene, to whatever little extent that I can do through a podcast like this. Because it seems like, to me, it seems like more in the right direction. Like this is a kind of proper truing, the way you would true a wheel, you know. And so I want to thank you for choosing to engage your company in that way, because in my mind, you know, it's like, that's not the quickest way to make the most money for your investors. You know, like, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, there's a real feel that you actually care as much about the space and about the people and about the medicine of the thing as you do creating a successful business. And that's something that I really respect.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I do think that we don't really have to choose between a successful business and doing all these other things. You know, Tactogen is a public benefit corporation, and we recognize the huge need for these types of healing experiences and, you know, technologies. And if access really is going to be a problem, and it's clear that it is, then developing something that addresses the access issue and tries to make the therapeutic technology something that's as open to the, you know, just the intelligence of the community is going to be a way that you can succeed. And so I think that that's going to be something where ultimately we're going to be able to grow and affirm and help each other while also keeping investors happy.
Yeah, see, that's good. It feels something like a strategic set of moves that increases actual value over the long term, rather than a strategic set of move that increases perceived value for profit purposes quickly, without a real sense that the value created in the short term translates to actual value in the long term. I feel like this is my own ideas. Obviously, I'm trying to think this through. That's what it seems to me. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is like kind of off topic, but you know, a reason that stock buybacks are, you know, controversial, is that if a company has extra money on hand, they could use it to innovate, or they could use it to just buy up some of their own stocks, and buying up their own stocks will increase the stock value, which is, you know, something that makes current investors happy, you know. But if you're not innovating, you're sort of decreasing the long-term possibility space and your long-term profits. And so this is like, it seems vaguely similar to this, where if we're not really trying to solve real problems, we're just cannibalizing the future. We're just, you know, making things look good in the here and now, but we're not going to have a long-term important positive impact. And so, you know, of course, that's our goal, is to have an important positive impact. And so we purposely try to align the activities and interests of the company with what we believe to be the long-term health of the community.
And this, I feel like, going back to the article you wrote that was published on Chacruna, and this could be sort of closing stuff before I ask you about more details for contact, etc. Is this kind of what you meant when you said, talking about Wasson and the impact that his life article made on Maria Sabina and that town in Mexico? You said, he made mushrooms more available, but healthcare less effective. Let's not repeat that mistake today. Quote, is that kind of what you're speaking to here? That you're trying to create a scenario where it's not just, oh yeah, now people can have legal access to psilocybin, but actually it's like, no, now there's actually a positive impact that people can touch into and access things that care for their health personally, collectively, socially, etc., through walking this sort of legislative pathway with psychedelic biotech and therapeutic development.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think that, all right, I lost the thread there for a second. We have we have an opportunity right now to do something big. And this is a window of opportunity that I don't think is going to be open forever. And so I think it's really important to take it. And that's what we're going to do. Ultimately, I don't think that, psychedelics have been as safe as they generally are and as valuable as they generally are because of some pharmacological effect that's inside the molecule, such that if you drop this molecule into a parallel earth where there was no history of psychedelic use, that it would be as safe and therapeutic. I think, on contrary, what is true is that the community has learned how to use these molecules. And, in many cases, the community extends back to indigenous groups. And we have a tradition of keeping each other safe and helping each other to have benefits from these practices with these molecules. And to try and take the psychedelics out of this largely underground tradition and just drop it into the medical system isn't really going to work, because I think a lot of the value comes from the cultural set and setting. And a lot of the safety comes from the cultural set and setting. And so as we work to set up this, new, medicalized psychedelic system, we really do have to think about the broader context and how can we strengthen and maintain and make the community healthier. And if we do that, I think we can really see powerful, transformative outcomes. So that's what the focus is.
Yeah, it makes me think, when you said window of opportunity, you said something about the patents. Once they're set, regardless of how bad they are, it's expensive, it's an ordeal to undo them, and it'd be better to intervene before it happens. So what I'm hearing you speak to is this window of opportunity. We have an opportunity to engage this sort of whoa, here comes the psychedelics, in a way that sets us up for a positive long-term future, or we could engage it in a way that actually just further doubles down on what's not working. And once the window of opportunity closes, we're going to end up with one or the other. And ideally, we're in the positive side of it, because if we're in the negative, it's going to be very difficult to start shifting track once we're on it. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. But the truth is that we're going to try a lot of different things at once, and so there's going to be parallel developments outside the medical system to make these medicines more accessible, and hopefully, in the end, we can arrive at some sane set of choices that people can make, and hopefully, a lot of them will be ones that strengthen connection with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, community. Community. Yeah. The individual thrives in community. It's there's a lot of things happening, and that's why complex systems tend to evolve and thrive, and complicated systems tend to collapse under the weight of their own hubris, bureaucracy. Yep. That's great, Matthew. Excellent conversation. Great work. Well, I experienced it really positively. I guess how it was received by the listeners will decide how excellent it was, but I thought it was great. And I'm really appreciating you coming on the show and the work that you're doing with Tactogen and otherwise. Is there any specific contact links or website URLs you'd like to leave us with for people to follow up with your work or Tactogen's work?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a mailing list that we don't send out too much on. So you can go to tactogen.com, our website, and sign up to be added to our list there. And that's a great way to keep in touch. I used to be on Twitter a lot, but I've stopped using Twitter largely given the policies of the new owner, the ever-changing policies of the new owner. I am on Mastodon. So if you're on Mastodon, that's a great place to stay in touch as well. And, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been delightful, and I hope that the listeners find some value in it as well. And I just want to express my gratitude, not just for the conversation, but also say that I feel super lucky to be at this moment in time. If you had told me in 1985, when I was like a young drug nerd, exploring psychedelics, that there would come a time when I would have the resources to invent new ones and the resources to test them for safety and ultimately maybe even bring some to market, I would have just laughed at you. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is really, really just the opportunity of a lifetime, and I'm going to do my best to deliver on it.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Matthew. And thanks again for this. I'll make sure links to everything that you said are in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com for the listeners. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And cut. Okay, so that's all for this episode. Thanks for listening all the way to the end here. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do follow up with Tactogen and Matthew's work if you are interested in learning more about what's going on there. I was actually exposed to Mastodon for the first time when Matthew brought that up. I am not presently on it, but I have left a link to where you can follow Matthew on that social media platform in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. An extra time-sensitive thing is that Matthew will be speaking at the Psychedelic Science Conference that is happening in Denver of this year, 2023, June 19th to the 23rd. So if you're going to be out in Denver for the conference, do check out Matthew's talk there. And hey, if you end up chatting with him, tell him I said hello. Otherwise, I don't have any more details about psychedelic science. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, so you'll have to do your own research if you are looking for tickets and so on and so forth. But I'm sure it should be no problem to look that up. So that's it. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked it, please do share it out there in the world. Word of mouth is the way in which this podcast grows. So much appreciated for helping do so. And if you are finding value in it and you presently have some financial resources to sort of kick back in appreciation my way for the production of this show, as well as the larger efforts and body of work that go into being the person producing this show for you, please do become my patron on Patreon or leave me a one-time donation. Links to do so are in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. If you'd like to just follow me online, you can do so by looking me up on Instagram, where I'm putting out more sort of clips from various episodes and kind of getting into the Instagram content thing a little bit now that I'm finished with my mental health break from the Instagram world. I've also got a Telegram channel and a newsletter, and you can follow me on Twitter. The handles for all of that are in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking out. Safe bet is James W. Jesso, but on Instagram, it's @Mind Podcast. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for contributing financially or non-financially through social distribution of the episode, and for following me online and listening all the way to the absolute very end of the episode. I will see you on the next one. Take care.